Always a pleasure to see you and speak with you, dear David. On behalf of the Center for Strategic Philanthropy at the University of Cambridge, thank you in advance for taking the time to share your always excellent insights with us. David Miliband is, of course, the president and CEO of the New York headquartered International Rescue Committee, the IRC, which conducts humanitarian relief operations in over 40 countries, I believe. Founded in 1933 at the request of Albert Einstein, the IRC has been on the front line, helping refugees and communities devastated by humanitarian crises around the world to both survive and to rebuild their lives and livelihoods. Under David's leadership, the organization has significantly expanded its global footprint and further enhanced its already impressive capacity to respond with incredible speed to a host of humanitarian crises, including conflict, wars, and other disasters. Before joining the IRC in 2013, David was a somewhat unusually popular member of Parliament in the UK for over a decade, including serving with distinction as a minister in a number of key portfolios. 14 years ago, while he was Secretary of State for the Environment, David actually oversaw the introduction of the world's first legally binding emissions reduction standards. And as Foreign Secretary from 2007 to 2010, he represented the UK on the world stage during a period of global economic upheaval at the time. And he's obviously navigating this year's crisis from a very different vantage point, which is where I'd like to begin. David, what trends or forces are driving the demand on the IRC, most of all, but not limited to, of course, COVID-19? And what more can philanthropists be doing to help address or mitigate some of these challenges? You know, I've heard you argue quite convincingly that the global refugee challenge is manageable and not unsolvable. And so what are some of the practical things that people, not necessarily directly engaged in the sector, can be doing to help solve it?
Well, first of all, Badr, I want to say hello. You've been a great friend, and our discussions have always been incredibly beneficial to me in helping me get a global perspective on some of the issues that are really wicked and difficult. And so it's nice to know that and to follow up the discussion we had in Davos in January about the role of this really important Center for the Philanthropy at Cambridge. I'm sorry you don't have people punting behind you on the River Cam as a Cambridge backdrop. I don't know if the university has not yet invested in a backdrop of
next time.
But I think this is an important conversation, and there are two parts to your question, aren't there? One is about trends, and one was about the role of philanthropy. And just to give people a bit of a sense of where I'm speaking from, we have 200 field sites with 13,000 employees and 17,000 volunteers in about 35 countries around the world, and about 800 staff in the United States and 25 offices who are dedicated towards refugee resettlement and supporting asylum seekers. The trends that we see, I think, are 3 or 4-fold, really. First, there's obviously the COVID emergency itself, which in all candor, in direct health terms, has been less of a killer than we would have expected. The fact that it seems that 80% of cases in Africa, for example, are asymptomatic, defies the prediction that I think I would have made if we'd been having this conversation 6 months ago, that densely populated populations with poor water and sanitation would see COVID running rife and a trail of destruction in its wake. There has been death and destruction. Much of it is not well recorded, but it's not been on the scale that I expected. So that's the first trend. Secondly, there's the non-COVID health impacts. And the trend there, interruption of supply chains for immunizations, people fearful of going to the health center. That's actually quite serious. And we're seeing a diminution of health care of pretty sizable kind. The third trend is the economic and social collateral damage of COVID and its lockdowns. And that is very serious indeed. I mean, I've got the figures here, 265 million people expected to face life-threatening hunger this year. And so at a time when fewer people are reaching our clinics, more people are facing the most acute economic needs, which I suppose is represented by these fact that famine is now being predicted in 3 countries, in Nigeria, in South Sudan, and in Somalia. So the third trend, I think, is to this economic and social collateral damage. But of course, underpinning these relatively short-term impacts of COVID, there's the wider picture, which is that the world is becoming more integrated, but nations are becoming more nationalist. So you're seeing this disjunction between an increasingly important global commons, an increasingly important interdependence globally, but a deglobalization politically. And the fact that COVID has come along and has represented that, I mean, the fact that the United States is pulling out of the World Health Organization is a symbol of its own questioning of its role in the world. But I think that we see in many of the places we work a crisis of diplomacy. I mean, Syria is suffering a crisis of diplomacy. Yemen is suffering a crisis of diplomacy. There is diplomacy in Afghanistan, but it seems to be driven more by politics than by the conditions on the ground. And so I think that fear that our interconnected world is being mismanaged by disconnected politics is a mega trend or a meta trend that people in business and in philanthropy need to be concerned about, and certainly people in the NGO sector are on the receiving end of. Now that leads me, I'm sorry about the length of my answer, but I know you're meant to do a 15-minute interview. This is going to turn into 150 minutes if we're not careful, but this at least lays the ground. I mean, the role of philanthropy isn't to substitute for government, but it is to lead government when government isn't leading. And so I always say to people, philanthropy is our risk capital because governments aren't willing to take risks. Philanthropy is our out of the headlines capital because governments are often drawn to headlines. Philanthropists need to be drawn by principle. Philanthropy is our special needs capital for groups who are underserved by conventional donors, the hardest to reach in the countries that aren't fashionable or are out with the reach of governments. That's where I think philanthropy has an important role. And my very strong belief is that philanthropists and NGOs and the private sector need to offer leadership when government isn't, and then try and drag governments along by showing that there are solutions. Because the International Rescue Committee, as you know from your position on the board of advisors, we pride ourselves as an NGO that focuses on solutions, not just on suffering. And that is really important at this time. And it's where philanthropy, I think, has a critical role to play.
So let me turn to the emerging markets. For years now, there's been a major shift underway in the global economy, and you can see it on the ground in many parts of Africa, the Middle East, and developing Asia. And of course, I'm talking about the rapid growth of the world's emerging economies and the associated creation of wealth in these markets. What impact do you think that the rise of these fast-growing economies could have on our ability to fund humanitarian relief operations and to develop coordinated local solutions to complex local challenges?
Well, I think that the starting point for that is to recognize that when it comes to humanitarian aid, 80-90% comes from conventional quote-unquote Western donors. But they are decreasingly willing to bear the whole burden, the whole responsibility. And the second starting point I would make is that part of the wealth creation in emerging markets comes from connection to the global economy. And so my message is a simple one. Those who are doing well out of the growth in emerging markets, if they want to continue to enjoy the blessings of the connected world, they're going to have to face up to the responsibilities of the connected world. And we're beginning to see that, which I think is encouraging. Then let me give two parts of where I think it's going to have impact. One you referred to, which is that if we're working in Northeast Nigeria, it's great and powerful to have not just local staff, but local philanthropy supporting us. There is credibility, there is legitimacy, there is sustainability, there is knowledge that comes from local capital. If we're working in the Middle East, you know well, then for all that there are dangers of being seen on one side or the other, we're a neutral organization. Humanitarian work is independent It's the principles of humanitarian action are about independence, neutrality, impartiality. And so I think it's very important to recognize that when you go local, the danger is that you become partisan. And so it's very important to get the benefits of localization without the partisanship of localization. And that needs to be a self-denying ordinance when you're funding humanitarian work in your own backyard. The second thing that I think is really important is that I hope philanthropists in emerging markets are going to correct the failings of Western philanthropy. They're not just going to copy it. There are some great things about Western philanthropy, but too often it's short-term. Too often it's boutique with a premium on novelty rather than a premium on scale, a reinvention of the wheel rather than taking the wheel to more places. And so I think there's room for philanthropy and relationships of organizations like mine with philanthropists in emerging markets to show that there are better ways of doing things. And that's certainly what we would like to see.
So turning to the nature of capital for a second, are you seeing an uptick in the use of blended finance or other innovative approaches to financing projects in the work that you're doing? What kind of innovation would you like to see more of in this space? And how can we better enable pooling of resources, I guess, between donors from different sectors and from different parts of the world?
I mean, the short answer is no, we're not seeing blended finance. I mean, humanitarian aid is often seen as too complicated, too dangerous for research studies, outcome targets, impact evaluations. We reject that completely. We are the International Rescue Committee. I know it's something that attracts you about the organization. We are the largest impact evaluation agency in the humanitarian sector. We reject the idea that just because it's a matter of life and death, you can't measure it. Quite the opposite. Because it's a matter of life and death, you should measure it. And you need to make the dollars or the euros or the pounds go further. Now, and in the future, maybe the renminbi go further. The truth, though, is that we are seeing growing emergencies and a race to catch up. And that's not a good scenario for complicated blended finance. This may be galling to you or disappointing, but longer term finance would be an innovation for us. I mean, we are running 450 government grants. They're a year in length. I mean, even when we have to do renewals, there's bureaucracy. So if philanthropic finance comes in and says, look, we're interested in 3 to 5 years because we know this problem's not going away, that would be an innovation. If there is innovation, if there is a finance that is linked to outcomes rather than linked to inputs, that would be innovation. Blending immediately means committees, complication. There's a danger that we get caught up in our own complexity. And I would urge that we think about outcomes, that we think about timescales, that we think about innovation, and then we can think about partners. Now, there's one caveat or rider. It would be great to think that philanthropists and donors in emerging markets and elsewhere that you're working with, you hinted at this, they come together. And rather than trying to invent the wheel themselves, they actually come in behind proven plans that we've developed or proven innovations that we want to roll out.
So you've already touched on the politics of it, but you've spent a large part of your career in the political arena, and although it's never been for the faint of heart, we do seem to be dealing today with unusually high levels of polarization, disinformation, and in some cases just a complete lack of trust in institutions. Do we really stand a chance at solving the world's acute problems in such an environment? And what could be done to reverse some of these unfortunate trends?
Well, I think that it's up to us is the answer to you. I mean, rather than predicting whether or not we are going to succeed or fail in the next 30, 50 years, I think it's up to us to make sure that we make as much progress as possible. I mean, there are dark clouds. But there are more resources than ever to make a difference. And I think that's what we should focus on, really. I think that we need a humility about the scale of the problems. The managing an interdependent world of 8 billion people is a challenge on a scale that's probably never been known. But if you see some of the changes that have been made in some countries, I mean, the country that you come from is an example, the changes that have happened in the space of 1 or 2 generations, that would have seemed like a dream or a utopia or a revolution, just a sort of something out of a novel. in some of the changes that have happened, never mind the changes on a larger scale in China or elsewhere. And so I think that my maxim is that the resources are there to manage these problems. And if they're man-made problems, climate is a man-made problem, war is a man-made problem, poverty is a man-made problem, human-made problem, often man-made actually, but the human-made problems are amenable to human solutions. And it's our fault if we don't do it. And so I think we've got to get on with it. President Kennedy said just because when a problem's big, that's not a reason to delay, it's a reason to get started.
Hear, hear. Finally, I know that one of your strategic priorities at the IRC since 2013 has been to build and deepen partnerships with a growing network of public and private sector organizations. How would you encourage philanthropists, again, in the emerging markets, but everywhere, to build effective, long-term, and not just transactional partnerships with organizations such as the IRC?
I think that the key thing I've learned is to think in 360 degrees. Don't just think about the 90 degrees that is the signing of the check. Think about the exchange of ideas. Think about co-creation. Think about the exchange of expertise. There will be partners who want to write a check, but they've also got a law department that wants to do some pro bono work, or they've got an advertising department that wants to do some work, or they've got a group of young employees who want to spend a day shadowing an aid worker. There are ways of developing a partnership that can never pretend that the bottom line of a company is the same as the bottom line of an NGO, but can recognize that there are some shared elements in the bottom line, or shared contributors to the bottom line, human development, employee development being one of them. And so I think that thinking in the round about partnership so that there's real relationship, not just transaction, is really important.
David, as always, a pleasure, my friend. I very much look forward to our next in-person conversation. And in the meantime, wish you the best of health and success in everything that you do. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Badr. It's great to see you, and really look forward to more conversations and any feedback on the conversation that we've had from your viewers.
Thank you very much.